Thank you. It's my privilege to wrap up the opening set of comments from the panellists. My name's Michael Collins, and I represent Invest Europe, which is the organisation that was previously the European Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. We represent venture capitalists, private equity fund managers, and infrastructure funds. And you might be wondering why it is that an organisation that represents private capital is so interested in the debate around prospectus and around public issuance. And I think the answer to that is really quite simple and quite straightforward. During the life of a company, it will go through many different forms of ownership and require many different forms of finance. And often, private equity and venture capital fund managers, once they've finished making their contribution to the life of a company, will look to the equity markets as a way to hand that company on to its next set of owners. It's an inevitable, essential component of private equity and venture capital that at some point, the private equity manager, the venture capital manager wants to exit that investment and find a new home for it, find a new owner, and often find new and additional sources of investment so that company can grow. And the public equity markets are a potentially very important option for private equity and VC managers to consider when they are coming towards the end of their period of ownership of a company. And it is an option that they choose. It is a route that they go down. Around about 16-17% of the total value of exits in any year currently is on the equity markets, combination of initial public offering, IPO, and selling of quoted equity. So 16-70%. That's a reasonable chunk of the private equity and venture capital business that's going on and going into the public markets. But that only represents around about 8% of the companies that private equity and venture capital back. So 16-17% of the total value, but only 8% of the companies. And what that tells you is that an awful lot of companies that are backed by private equity and venture capital don't see the public equity markets as being an option for their next stage of financing, their next stage of ownership. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. There are lots of good reasons often why a private equity manager or a venture capital manager will look to, for example, a corporate sale. If you've got a great tech company, it may well be that the obvious place to place that company next in its life is with one of the big global tech players. It may be that the next obvious home for a company is another private equity or venture capital manager who's got the scale or the expertise to take that company to the next level. But we certainly want to see public markets as being one of the options, one of the choices that is genuinely available to private equity and VC managers when they're looking to exit a company. As I say, there are lots of reasons why you might not choose the public market route. But certainly one barrier, one disincentive, one discouragement to doing it is the cost of accessing those public markets, which Deirdre has already mentioned. And the reality is, and this data is actually FESE data, the reality is that for smaller companies, smaller issuances, actually the regulatory cost, the burden of compliance with all of the requirements, all of the hoops that you have to jump through, can be really quite significant and can act as a genuine impediment to people's willingness to consider that as a route for exit. It doesn't have to be that way. Experience in the US over the course of the last few years has been quite interesting. And again, one wouldn't want to suggest that regulatory change is the only factor that's driving market behaviour, driving appetite for IPOs in the US. But I think it's quite telling that when the US Jobs Act entered into force and they created this new regime for emerging growth companies, for high growth potential companies, you saw a real kickstart to the IPO market in the US. Now, I really don't want to overstate the significance of the regulatory change, because there are lots and lots of reasons why IPO markets ebb and flow, why going to public markets become more or less attractive. But certainly that regulatory regime, the creation of a regime that is designed to encourage those high growth potential companies to come back to the market, or in many cases come to the market for the first time, is definitely something that needs to be considered. Because while it is important that we think about SMEs, it's also the case that a lot of the companies that have received VC backing, in particular in the US, cease to be an SME according to a technical definition really quite quickly. But they're still at a particular stage of their life where they're needing significant sums of money, where they need very, very rapidly new rounds of finance, new rounds of finance, new rounds of finance. And if every time they have to seek that additional level of finance, they're faced with some significant regulatory costs and some significant regulatory burden, then you discourage their growth, you discourage that investment. So for us, one of the really critical things that I think we would want to see from the prospectus regulation reform is a recognition that there is this variety of companies out there. There is this diversity in the system, the universe of companies that we're looking to get onto the public markets. As Deirdre very rightly pointed out, you've got a huge variety from these very small SMEs through family-owned companies that have been around for decades that are now looking to mature and develop, to these very high growth emerging companies. And we need a European regime, we need a prospectus regulation that recognises that diversity and realises that often the companies that are facing the biggest challenges are not just those that are SMEs, but are those that have grown from nothing to really quite sizable status and quite sizable activity really quite quickly. But in terms of their ability to manage the regulatory regime and their ability to manage the regulatory burden, are still in very many respects similar to SMEs. Those are the kinds of companies that the US has shown itself over the last few years to be very successful at growing and developing, partly through the success of the venture capital industry in the US, but partly through the recognition in the US Jobs Act that category of company needs some particular treatment. And we think we should be looking to try and find some kind of equivalent regime, some kind of equivalent system for those companies here in Europe, so that we can keep more of them here in Europe. Because the origins of these companies can quite easily be in Europe. We have the talent, we have the entrepreneurship, we have the innovation. What we need to get right is the financing system that enables them to stay here and to grow here, rather than feeling, as is too often the case, that they need to up sticks and move across the Atlantic. Thanks very much.